Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ezra Calvert with Entrada Insights on behalf of TTRA. Welcome. Just a couple reminders for you. All lines are muted. Everyone is on listen-on mode. We'll be using the chat feature on the Zoom for questions and answers. So let's make sure we use the chat feature. Our guest speaker today is Vince Kuzma. He's the Director of Customer Experience at Kalibri Labs. He's an expert in hospitality technology. In his role at Kalibri Labs, he works with hoteliers, brands, DMOs, management companies in integrating Kalibri Labs technology and performance metrics into their operations. Prior to Kalibri Labs, he worked at Duero, a SaaS company. He is a graduate of Cornell University in hospitality. And something fun about Vince, he lived in Beijing and he's fluent in Mandarin. Vince, I don't know how to say welcome in Mandarin, but welcome here to be with us with the TTRA group today. We have seen you present and be present at the Marketing Outlook Forum and many TTRA events. Welcome, and the mic is yours.
Thanks, Ezra, for that great introduction. It's an honor to be here and to be speaking with all of you who've joined. As Ezra mentioned, I work at Kalibri Labs, which is a hotel technology and data company. And so today I'm going to be reviewing some of our proprietary metrics and trends that we've been tracking primarily through 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic. So we'll be reviewing, kind of how things have been playing out, what segments and hotel types have been affected, and then we're going to drill into a little more on how you can look at these things at a market level. We have a couple of free resources that have been, tracking certain markets, and then, we certainly have data available for those of you who are interested in using it maybe more in your day-to-day. So just a little background about Kalibri. We were founded in 2012, and we were really started as a way to address the rising costs that the hotel industry was facing. Now, the way that we wanted to address this is through better benchmarking that not only tracked hotel performance by segment, but also got into the cost of distribution and started benchmarking hotels by net revenue. So really looking at profit contribution and kind of going deeper than traditional benchmarking metrics that were really just top-line revenue. So at this point, we have pretty much every brand in the US in our database. We have about 35,000 hotels, and our data is really detailed. So we're not just getting total hotel numbers, again, what has traditionally been available. We're actually getting every single reservation that goes through every single hotel. So we're adding about 100 million reservations a month. And with that data, we've been able to get really granular and help individual properties. But we also have a lot of useful data for people looking at the market level, particularly DMOs and CVBs. So just to explain a little bit more about the data before I show you the trends and some of the components with recovery analysis, I do want to explain some of these words I'll be using throughout the presentation and put them in a little more context for you who don't live and breathe hotels like I do every day. So with our revenue and with our kind of occupancy and ADR numbers, we're able to show that information by channel. So looking at things like what was booked through brand.com, or what was booked through a call center, or what was booked through Expedia. We're also able to show things by rate category. And so that if you're looking kind of for customer profiling, we can show you what exactly is being booked on a AAA rate, what AARP rates are booking, again, every different rate category. So there are 16 of those, things like corporate business, group business, et cetera. We're also able to look at things by length of stay. I think this is maybe a little less useful for DMOs at large, but there are certain markets that have longer length of stays and have been of particular interest to extended stay developers. And so maybe if you're in a market where there is a lot of extended stay demand, information about length of stay and how that's changing could be useful. And then on the right side of this slide, these are more on the kind of cost and brand analysis side of the world. You'll hear me talk a couple of different times about guest paid revenue or hotel collected revenue. Those are going to be different revenue types that we are tracking. I'm not going to get into too much detail on the evolving cost of distribution for hotels, but just know that when we're talking about guest paid or hotel collected, there's a slight nuance there that I may clarify if it's important. So now let's talk about how the US is doing and look at some of these trends that we've spoken about. I would like to mention a lot of these slides that we're going through today. The data is coming from a live free dashboard that we are publishing on our website. It's kalibrilabs.com/industry health. And the data on that link gets updated every Tuesday morning. And it's really useful. So I'm going to be talking through some components of this dashboard, but feel free to check it out because there is some information there that we will not be covering today. The first data point on that dashboard is going to be the weekly hotel performance by rate category. We're tracking 6 of the most largest rate categories by revenue share in the US and looking at how that revenue is changing week by week for all hotels. We are also looking at flight data. We have a partnership with a company called Forward Keys that looks at reservation data and kind of inbound and outbound metrics by market. And so we're tracking, I think, 10 major markets with flight data. That's been really helpful to kind of understand demand that may or may not be hitting hotels. As you all probably know, flight bookings tend to be an indicator of hotel volume. And tracking that has been one of the things that we are using when we are planning these different recovery scenarios by market. After that, we are looking at some global search traffic. I'm not going to be spending too much time on this data point today, but there are certain websites like Hilton.com or Expedia.com where we are looking at the traffic to those websites. This could be useful when looking at bookings and also cancellations. We've seen a lot of cancellation trends be in line with this trend, especially at the beginning of the recovery, but hopefully that traffic going to these sites soon will be to reserve future travel. The next data point, I think, will be very important for a lot of you who may have been trying to understand in your market how many hotels are open and operating. So we will be going into, again, at a US level, what things are looking like, and then talking a little bit more about which types of hotels are open. So, are they luxury? Are they mid-scale? Are they economy? And so we'll get into some of those details today. And then finally, and this is an important one for, again, our recovery analysis, is the group block pickup and cancellations. So on top of the weekly hotel performance data that we're getting from all the brands, we are also getting about 200 or so hotels that are sending us all of their group future blocks. And so, what groups do they have on their books now for the rest of 2020 and the beginning of 2021? And so you can see, which we will review today, how those reservations have been changing, either cancellations or bookings. And so again, week by week, it's been critical to track how this demand and booking patterns have changed. And group as a segment, we know, is being hit very hard right now due to the restrictions on number of people that can exist. So we're certainly in uncertain times, but I'll be talking a little bit more about these data sources and how they can be helpful as you start to understand and plan for your own market's recovery. The first thing, and again, this is more of a live interactive thing on the website, but the first thing that I wanted to show is that we are tracking year-over-year RevPAR change by state. RevPAR, for those of you who may not know, is revenue per available room. It's one of the standard metrics that hotels use to measure their success. And so you can see here, state by state, how things have been shifting. Thankfully, not every state is being hit as some of the worst ones that have been in the news. In March, we were predicting about a 55% drop in RevPAR year over year. And you can kind of see from the scale on the right, that might have been a little optimistic. We'll see how things settle off. We'll see if kind of Q3 and Q4 have some business they can maintain, or hopefully not, things close down again. But looking by state and by region is really important, and also by traveler type, which we'll get into a little later. Now, to break down those total revenue numbers, we find that if you're just looking at revenue in hotels, it doesn't really tell a good story. Who is making up that revenue? Is it a weekend soccer team? Is it a midweek corporate traveler? Is it an international traveler? And so we've started to track this information with all rate categories combined, which is this first view here on the left. But then we have also been tracking it into some of the most important rate categories. And the two on the right here are an example of that: OTA, which are things like Expedia and Booking.com. And then below that is the promotion and loyalty member rate. So, first and foremost, the thing I want to point out is we hope that the week of April 10th was the worst we've seen. You can see across all traveler, types, there is a week over week increase that has been continuing through May, through the first couple weeks of June, and we'll see what the summer, kind of pans out. But what is driving that recovery is critical to understand, because we do know things like group have not come back. And so, again, one clarification, that guest paid ADR, you can just think of that as the rate the guest is paying. These are special Kalibri terms, but in your mind, you can just think of that as the rate. So on the right side, you can really see that these two segments have been two of the big drivers for that upward curve across all rate categories. And this is really important for hotel operators, because they are basically having to choose if they want to pay Expedia to promote their hotel, or if they want to invest in the branded promotions that companies like IHG and Hilton or Hyatt does on their behalf. And as you can see, those two segments are really at a kind of two-horse race for this recovery. And they're kind of the two segments that we are seeing the most leisure travel go to. And that's been an important thing to keep an eye on, that trend. What I don't have pictured on here, but I do encourage you to check out is, if you know that your market is dependent on a lot of corporate business, or on, a lot of advanced purchase leisure business, or even group, those other segments we are tracking just like you see here on the screen on our website. And so you can keep an eye on how things are evolving over time. The next data point that I want to get into is hotel closings. Chain scale simply represents the category of hotel. You can see we have luxury on the high end side all the way down to economy. And you'll also notice that we are separating out independents. As a reminder, our database is made up of branded properties. We are getting our information directly from the brands, which is to say we do not have every independent hotel in our database. So you can see here for this example, for this data point, we have separated out independents so you can see from a hotel closure point how things are looking. To get this information, we are really working on a two-step process. The first step is we are looking at the rates that hotels have posted online. So we're getting that data from a company called Hotel Compete. So every day they do all of the rate shoppings for everywhere a hotel could sell. And if they come back with no rates available, they will let us know. And then we cross-reference that hotel data against our reservation data and see if we have any reservations that have come in for that same hotel. And only if it kind of passes both checks do we mark it as closed. Again, so we know this data is probably underrepresenting all of the hotels that are closed. There have certainly been hotels, due to their commercial loan agreements, that have to stay open. Even if they're not accepting reservations, they're open. And so at a proxy, we think this is a very valid number that you can kind of use to understand how supply is behaving in your market. And we do, again, have this data available at the market level, just not on that free dashboard. But I think the important takeaway from this data set at a US level is that if you're in a maybe secondary or tertiary market that is more reliant on the mid-scale or upper mid-scale supply, you've probably fared better than a lot of the major markets, especially ones with luxury and a lot of international business. Across the board, luxury hotels have been hit the hardest. They have kind of closed first and stayed closed. I know in some markets they're being used for relief aid, but across the board at a segment, they've been hit the hardest. Whereas on the lower end, those hotels have kind of maintained business, and a lot of the numbers that we're seeing across the US in terms of performance has really been on the kind of lower end, cheaper rate type of business, especially drive-in areas. Again, kind of that was some of the first business we saw come back in Florida and Texas. That business probably won't continue in the same form that we saw it based on some of the recent news, but there is a chance for more local regional traffic that typically is going to be in the upper mid-scale, and economy segments. Another data point that I want to review with you all is our airline bookings for some of these top markets. And again, if you go on that dashboard, you'll be able to see, I think it's 10 markets plus the US total in a data table. But on this chart, you can see that we are looking at Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, and Atlanta. The two that I kind of selfishly have been looking at are Atlanta and Dallas, because we did see, those cities kind of had a different maybe procedures than the US at large. And there were a couple weeks where, things were really coming back in terms of flights, but it's a little obscured by the label. There has been a drop off from the week of June 10th. And so again, I think as some of these states have revisited their travel policies, we will see these airline bookings represent that. And that's a really critical data point that we're watching to kind of predict by market how things are coming back. I now do want to talk a little bit about our Market Spotlight series. So this is on our website as well. And you can see in the kind of top left area of the slide that we have done about 7 markets so far. We did just release, again, every Tuesday, the latest market. And so it's really interesting to kind of do these case studies because we're doing an analysis of 2019. And then we're comparing that against the trends that we've seen in 2020 year to date, and then extrapolating through a couple different recovery scenarios, what the recovery trajectory for these markets might look like. Now, if you happen to be in one of these markets, here's some nice free data for you. We've kind of done it, and we've split it out by your chain scale tier, so you can see how luxury is performing compared to the economy. We have some really critical metrics for you to see, like occupancy, ADR, RevPAR, and booking costs. So again, we are very invested in the profitability of hotels. Again, it's not a metric that all destinations are looking at, but it's certainly something that we are tracking. And just in terms of some major takeaways from the markets we've done, some of them, like Miami, were in unique positions with Super Bowl, where 2019 was a great year, and recovery against that as a benchmark is going to be kind of hard. Also, Miami is very reliant on international inbound travel, and for the time being, that most likely is not going to be there. But unlike other markets, they are less reliant on group business. And so again, kind of the composition of travelers in your market is really going to determine your recovery timeline. And so each market kind of has their unique demand drivers that are going to make certain recovery scenarios more likely. Another example with Dallas, a market that is really strong with corporate business, that could take a hit. One of the segments that we don't know if it's ever going to fully recover is corporate. With all of the kind of digital tools and remote interactions that have become more popular through this crisis, there is a projection that some of that corporate travel will not come back and will kind of stay digital, but we'll see. And so, you know, for markets that are really heavy corporate, we certainly expect that to be maybe closer to the group recovery timeline than the, you know, weekend leisure recovery timeline. But not all corporate's gone. You know, we have seen infrastructure projects continue. We have seen kind of local, you know, more local type drive-in corporate business continue. But if you were really reliant on big conferences or really reliant on big international or big national or international accounts for that corporate business, again, that may be something that's kind of end of 2021 or even 2022 for some markets. But I encourage you to go through those market spotlights. We have them coming out every Tuesday, so it's a good cadence of data. And if nothing else, you may have just some tidbits on 2019 or 20 that could apply to where you are. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we are looking at recovery planning. And so, you know, in those market spotlights, we certainly end on what recovery might look like for that market. But we do have some information we've been tracking, you know, for the US at large and how recovery curves have shaped up. So these charts I'm about to show you may look familiar to the rate category curves that we looked at before. But unlike those where we were just showing occupancy and rate for one at a time, here we can see demand share for these 5 different rate categories. And so at the top, you're seeing a week by week trend in 2020. And then the bottom was the 2019 numbers. And so, you know, for comparison, we saw that group in 2020 was 14.7% for the entire US across all chain scales. So luxury all the way down to economy. And then, you know, as soon as March 2020 hit, that bottomed out. So group was one that kind of fell the hardest, the fastest. And maybe tried to come back a little bit in April, but has continued to really be a tough segment. And that's a segment that we are projecting to have the longest recovery curve of any of these traveler types. And so again, if you were in a market that had big convention business, that had big, you know, group blocks, massive hotels, it's going to be hard to replace that demand and that revenue. There's certainly other demand drivers that are going to happen. And, you know, hotels will adapt and change and maybe get a little more creative with how they sell their space. But at large, we know that that segment is not going to behave like it did in 2019 for maybe 2 or 3 years. 2019 was a really great year for a lot of markets, so it's tough that that's the baseline. But thankfully, we do see some recovery happening in other segments. And, you know, like I mentioned on that previous slide, the OTA and promotion loyalty rates are the 2 that we're seeing rebound kind of in parallel. So you can see here with the teal and red lines, those are the 2 that really from the middle of April have been going up. And we're seeing the most business book with those rates. I am just going to click through a couple other versions of this same chart where we are looking at different chain scale combinations. So for this one, we just took out economy and luxury, kind of looking at the middle of the hotel world. And again, you can see it's a very similar story. And, you know, even as we go through upper upscale by itself, upscale, upper mid-scale, mid-scale, oh, went too far. For all of these, you're seeing those OTA and loyalty promotion rates be the 2 that are rebounding. And it's basically just varying in how much group business these different chain scales did. So again, if you're in a market that, you know, has a lot of courtyards, or if you're in a market that has a lot of, you know, days in or extended stay brands, you may have more demand than we're seeing in these national trends. But again, if you are a market that was very reliant on maybe the more expensive side of the industry, especially with regards to business travel and international travel, your 2020 kind of mix of business and 2021 mix of business is going to look very different than what you saw in 19.
Vince, sorry to interrupt. We have one methodology question just to make sure that if we can remind everyone with the segments what they mean, especially for the other segment, if we could rephrase those, that will be really helpful.
Yeah, that's a great question. So group business is group. So that one I think is straightforward. OTA, as mentioned, is your Expedia and Booking.coms. Other segments represents every other type. And so there are about 13 that get put in there. So things like AAA, AARP, advanced purchase, packages, your corporate, in this case, is going to be rolled in there. So basically anything that's not named. And I can definitely direct people to kind of our full list of segments if they're curious. Promotion and loyalty rates, those are going to be, I am a Marriott Rewards member. This is my Marriott Rewards kind of 10% off price. And then rack bar, that one's kind of an odd name, but that is just the kind of standard rate. If I'm not a loyalty member, I'm just, anonymous person going to Hilton.com, that's going to be the kind of no special deal rate. That typically is also the same rate that is sold on the OTAs, but we classify it differently in this case because we want to look at OTAs as a separate channel. So good question on that one. Thank you for having me clarify.
Thank you.
Now we're going to kind of go into the last part of the presentation before we do general Q&A. And this is a little case study that we've put together for Washington, D.C., just to kind of, again, highlight how some of our metrics can be looked at for a destination and what we're thinking about when we're looking at this data. So if we look at DC in 2019, we can see that they ran 73% occupancy, $172 guest paid ADR. So that is the guest paid ADR, what they paid including commissions. So if you booked through a third party, that took some money off before the hotel got it. That number is not typically represented. Again, I don't need to get into too many details, but that is kind of the rate the guest paid. We also have a cost number. Again, this is the booking cost, what it costs to actually get that reservation into the hotel's system. Loyalty percent, that was 59.3. And this was one of the highest actually in the US, which is to say more travelers staying in DC were associated with a loyalty membership than most markets. Almost 60% of all bookings in DC were someone staying with a membership. So pretty good. And then the last one, and this is a metric that has been very critical for recovery planning, is lead time. So, how many days in advance were people making reservations? And, you can see DC was all the way up to 26.6. So, a really good amount of lead time for their reservations. And that has been absolutely hammered, which has been a trend we're seeing in almost every market. The lead time, the booking lead time for these markets is extremely short, sometimes even under 7 days at this point. So I think, just due to the nature of how things are changing day by day, whether it's safe or not to travel, whether or not companies are, willing to kind of encourage travel or allow travel, all of that has resulted in people planning less ahead. And so, hotels, the way that they tried to bring reservations in and kind of do their planning, all of that's been interrupted. And, that's a question that we're helping hotels with every day, understanding which traveler types are in market and which they should be spending their marketing dollars to go after. So the lead time is a metric that's been very important to analyze. Now to look at May 2020, we can see that, all of those metrics, except for costs, I guess a small positive, have gone down in May 2020. Occupancy is really low. DC by nature is reliant on a lot of government business that was maybe halted due to furloughs or other things like that. A lot of the contract work was paused. Rate has gone down less than other markets. It's actually been able to retain for those rates that we're still selling. This metric is a little obscured by the luxury segment also. the fact that so many luxury hotels are closed, being the highest rated hotels in the market, that has kind of driven what looks like a big drop. But in fact, a lot of the hotels that are open have been able to maintain their rate better than we've seen in previous recessions, specifically '08 and '01. I think people have learned from those and have done their best not to unnecessarily downgrade their price. The people who are traveling, in this case, maybe have some money to spend because they haven't been doing their normal leisure activities. So it's been good to see that we've been able to maintain some rate. And then, finally on this one, I would say that loyalty percent, again, is mostly, I think, in relation to what hotels have been open. Keep in mind that this data is just for branded hotels. So, the independent hotels that we're not showing here, they most likely don't have a loyalty ID. So just a little qualifier on that data point. So what is recovery going to look like for DC? May was pretty bleak, and June is, continued to be bleak. But, as we saw with the different segment types at a US level, we do know that recovery and travel is still happening for certain types. And so what we've done for all of our markets is we've basically done a 3-year projection on what we think these segments will behave over the next, 2021, all the way out to 2022. And unfortunately, DC is looking to have a RevPAR decrease of 60 to maybe 72% year over year. I know I mentioned at a total US level, we were predicting about 55% down back in March. And DC, has been a market that's been a little over that average based on its mix of business. But depending on hotel type and depending on traveler type, these recovery scenarios will change. And so, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that, again, if you're a market that is really reliant on group business, that revenue may take truly until 2022 to get back to a meaningful place. But if you're able to have more of that, leisure-driven weekend traveler, especially if it's a drive-in market, even in state, when people are kind of looking at Texas, there's a hypothesis that people are still going to travel around and drive within the state. So there may be, more leisure business than at a national level we're seeing. And so again, if you're not looking at performance in your market by traveler type and by segment, you're going to have a hard idea understanding what may or may not come back and when. And so again, we just encourage you to use the free resources we have. Maybe you're lucky and you're in one of those markets that we did a spotlight. But in terms of recovery planning, we're seeing vastly different timelines across the US and by business type. And so as much as we can, we're trying to put out some baselines for people and track things like hotel closures and give you some indication of where things are week over week. But in terms of forecasting for the future, at a minimum, we're thinking, 50 to 60% down year over year in revenue. And then in terms of recovery planning, some markets are going to get, pretty close to whole, maybe 80% back by the end of 2021. But a lot of markets are going to see 2022 and beyond for certain traveler types. And then just to kind of give you one other way that we're looking at this, just to really articulate when we were showing those couple different rate categories and you saw a bunch of the business was in other is going to be everything to the right here. And so, for example, in DC, 65% of all of their revenue came from 4 segments: group, rack bar, corporate, and government. Government at a national level is not one of the top, but in DC it certainly is. And so when we're doing recovery analysis, the first thing we look at is, where is this revenue coming from? And then we're applying these various models that we've been using to extrapolate the recovery for each market. So again, for DC, unfortunately, with corporate and group being 2 of their top, it's going to be a tough sell in terms of recovery planning. But there is government business that has resumed and will resume. And we are hoping that DC is able to kind of remix on the transient side, and maybe from the local kind of DC, Maryland, Virginia community, still pull in travelers to try and, get as much 2020 revenue that's not coming from corporate and group as possible. And I think we've pretty much covered that. So we will break for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Vince. This was great. And it goes along with the things that we are seeing in the marketplace, how diverse the recovery is going to be. And it's surprising to see some destinations like Mississippi in your map was not as much impacted, whereas some other places are. And the business mix, the customer mix, looking at those nuances really allow us to understand what's happening in the market. So we are gonna be taking questions through the chat room, chat feature. I'm gonna start with Deanne's question because when you were talking about the closings, Deanne just chimed in and she mentioned about Katrina. And she's saying that it was reported that the hotels that were taken over to house people who had been affected and for workers coming in did not do well after those folks moved out during Katrina. In fact, some had to be torn down. Are you hearing that for hotels repurposed for COVID housing? Are there any rumor or talks about how these hotels are going to be repurposed, reshaped, or is that part of the slower closure process for some of these properties?
I really think there are kind of two ways you can look at it. I think in some cities, the hotels that they've been choosing for relief aid or that have opted in to be some of the hotels chosen for relief aid, these hotels may have just been closed fully had they not done that. And so, I don't want to kind of look at short-term versus long-term positioning, but I do think that the choice to host some of these groups was an effort to keep the doors open, was an effort to keep paying the employees that worked at those hotels and, try and stay afloat as much as possible. On the other hand, I do understand, from Katrina and from other unique scenarios, there maybe has been a perception change for hotels that have been involved. And I would say from our perspective, I think it's really going to come down to the safety and sanitation changes that happen. I know AHLA and other hotel groups have been working to come up with some sort of universal health standards. A lot of the governments around the world are doing this. Singapore just released kind of new cleanliness guidelines. And I really think if the message is more so on adopting new standards and kind of ensuring customer safety, whether a hotel or not was involved with hosting people back in April, people aren't going to remember that. I think there's going to be so much focus on, are these hotels clean? Do I have to worry about my personal safety? Am I going to come in contact with, high risk factors? And I know housekeeping teams and brands around the world are figuring this out to ensure the best guest experience possible. And so, I think the focus is going to be on what standards change. And therefore, it may be a little different than Katrina, where policies maybe didn't change. So in this case, because sanitation at large is under review, I would expect the focus to be more on those universal standards than on specific hotels that may or may not have hosted certain groups.
Yeah, and across the board, when we talk to tourism businesses, right now, I believe at least 9 out of 10 is doing something in regards to standards. And if they are not implementing anything, it means they are either in closure or they're not operating. Right. So everyone is in that norm. So that was a really good remark. And things that are coming from Singapore and even in the US with US Travel Association, travel confidently, implementing those messages and also the procedures have been very helpful from an operational standpoint. So Vince, I want to go back and touch upon some of the terminology again. I think everyone is used to looking at all standardized data and terminology. Just to remind ourselves with the definition of ADR. When you are looking at ADR, does that include any other resort fees, taxes, assessment, F&B, parking, anything like that? Or is it just room rate or any other OTA commissions?
So great question. When we are talking about guest paid ADR, that is going to be inclusive of commissions from third parties, which is why we gross that up. Now, when we are talking about the ADR that's reported on a hotel's P&L, the ADR that companies like STR use, we refer to that as hotel collected. The reason that we show guest paid ADR in most cases is because that gap can be pretty wide. On average in the US, it's $5. In certain markets like New York City, it's $8. And so again, what the hotels are receiving is far less than what the guests are paying. Historically, that's not been reported on. We also have a metric that you'll see on our website and other places called COPE ADR, and that is going to be the rate less all costs associated with that reservation. And so when you start to talk about the profitability of hotels, we're doing the analysis on the COPE level. And so all your fees and things like that are taken out at that metric. And so, on that slide where I said the 3 revenue types, those are guest paid, hotel collected, and COPE. Guest paid includes everything. Hotel collected is what's on the P&L or what STR uses. And COPE is our kind of net revenue profitability metric.
That's very helpful. And not everyone is looking into that profitability and how hotels are going through just on regular times dealing with these increasing costs. Right. Especially distribution was a big stress factor for hoteliers. So now with the pandemic creating such a halt in the industry, how would you compare that stress level the hotels are going through? Because it's an extended period of time. It's a muted recovery.
In terms of kind of customer sentiment and what we're hearing, I talk to hotels every day, whether it's the owner or the operator or the brand. And there's certainly a level of uncertainty that I don't think we've ever faced. I would say as an industry, we're made up of people that really like to travel and really care. And so there's a lot of optimism, even from the people who are on the daily line. But it's really just about figuring it out every day. A lot of these, companies kind of set a 3-month pause on their operation, and we're seeing them come back to life after that in March. And others are kind of on pause still till October. And so in some senses, I think people are in a summer mindset where maybe they're enjoying the time off and, they're a little distracted by a change of pace that they historically haven't had. In other senses, there's a lot of concern whether or not hotels are going to be able to stay open and they're going to be able to bring back their staff that may have been furloughed throughout this time. Personally, I have a lot of friends that are leaving travel, that are moving into other industries that kind of lost their job. And that's sad to see, especially because we don't know when travel is going to pick back up. Country by country, these things are evolving. And, hopefully we're able to just kind of get to a safe baseline so that we can, resume things early next year.
Yeah, definitely. It's a slower recovery. I'm going to move to Eric's question, a little bit uplifting for us. It's hard to talk about the forward-looking numbers, especially when it comes to end of 2020 or early 2021. So Eric, I think he's a faculty, Eric Backman. His question is, speaking from a university standpoint, what would be the procedure to collaborate with Kalibri Labs on communicating impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, such as data share, etc.? Who should I contact, email?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm your person. So I deal with all our university partnerships and kind of research proposals. So my email, it'll be on the next slide, but it's my first name, Vince@kalibrilabs.com.
And everyone, just making sure that you are aware, we are going to be sharing the PowerPoint with everyone. Just be in tune with that. TTRA is going to share that with everyone, so it will be delivered to you. And I also included the Kalibri Labs link on the chat feature. If you have a chance, it's a place that you should definitely go if you haven't been to it. Lots of good data points, indicators, even some from search, looking at those points. So I highly recommend that. Moving into next question that is coming from Nandi. She says, it was reported recently that short-term rentals are doing better than hotels on most performance metrics in the crisis. Do you have insights to compare or benchmark to the hotel data on the performance of short-term rentals, Airbnb, and non-hotel accommodations?
First of all, I would love to kind of see where you were getting that number, because it's a number I think that a lot of different sources are trying to calculate and represent. I think in some senses, short-term rentals have been a little more stable in certain markets. I think in other senses, a lot of them are offline that maybe we're not talking about, the kind of supply side of the business. And so perhaps the ones that are open in certain markets are doing well. On the other side, I'm sure a ton of Airbnbs and personal supply are closed off because people don't want them in their houses. Now, again, personally, I rented an Airbnb 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was a really nice kind of time on the Chesapeake. And so I do think that there is a traveler type that is maybe going to non-city center destinations and using short-term rental supply, especially maybe in areas near kind of nature, whether it be water or forest, cabins, things like that. On the other hand, I would be very skeptical that those numbers represent maybe everything that was open in 2019. Like we're seeing with STR numbers, they're posting occupancy of what's open, not of total supply. And so again, I would love to see where that report came from, because it's something that we are actively looking at also. We do have some short-term rental data in our database. Unfortunately, it's under some review, so we're not putting it into products, but it's definitely something that we're tracking and figuring out how we can position and incorporate, because we do know that it's a big part of the lodging kind of industry these days, and we want to be able to report on hotel versus short-term rental.
Yeah, and also Nandi shared a link from hotelnews.com that came out on July 8th, yesterday. And
cool.
It's relating to the research from Highland Group showing how short-term rentals are doing better.
Nice.
The demand and revenue data sometimes is better to look at from a short-term rental perspective. The occupancy data has been very up and down because of the supply and how it's reported. I feel like looking at just across the board, the coastal areas are doing better. The resort areas with short-term rentals, it's accessible. People can work remotely. We are seeing that slow vacations, slow travel trend that's coming into the market. So definitely a mixed market for everyone. And people are staying longer in some ways. That is really surprising.
Right. Yeah. And the point you mentioned too, there could be a shift in kind of remote work culture, where now that everyone's working from home, I'm going to go work from, destination for a week or two. And so, I think alternative accommodations are in a really unique position of maybe gaining some steam in this time. But yeah, we're not quite sure how it's going to pan out.
Yeah, I totally agree, Vince. I haven't traveled anywhere since late February, and I'm having I'm losing my mind. I love travel. And the other day I was like on Airbnb, I was on sites. I was
like dreaming of your next vacation.
I am dreaming of it. I'm like, maybe I can work remotely. This is too much.
That's what we're all having those same thoughts.
So in terms of one more question about methodology, we are going back to the definitions. You're putting everyone at questions. What is the definition of extended stay? This came from John, from your methodology perspective.
Yeah, so when we're considering an extended stay property, it's a property that has a certain percent of its reservations that are 30 plus nights. And so when we're reporting on things by length of stay, we typically have a couple different buckets. So, 1 to 5 nights, 6 to 13, 14 to 20, maybe. I forget our exact buckets. But when we're classifying an extended stay hotel, we both look at how the brand itself has positioned, but then also its percent of room nights by length of stay bucket, particularly focused on stays longer than 30 nights.
Yeah. Thank you, Vince. So I want to touch upon the closing hotels. You mentioned about sometimes how better the methodologies or how it's reporting. It's confusing to everyone right now, and I find myself looking at it every time I look at a report about lodging, any kind of lodging. Things are changing on a daily basis, whether it's the supply, whether it's the demand. So your data shows the economy hotels somewhat being modest across the board when we are looking at their consistency from a performance perspective, whereas the higher end hotels got hurt because they don't have enough of the demand. Regarding COVID-19 procedures, this last question that came from one of our participants, COVID-19 does impact more on low budget hotels compared to a high-star hotel, as high-star category hotel can maintain the more hygiene compared to a low-budget hotel. What do you think about this perception regarding standards, safety? We are all talking about this new practice.
I definitely think, the kind of hotels that have less staff are going to be faced with an operational challenge. Both in terms of the speed of turning hotel rooms, but then also kind of maintaining certain standards. Independent hotels, I think, are also in a similar boat where, you may not have the support of a mega corporation to prepare you to adapt and adjust and kind of give you the suppliers and the supply chain that is readily served up to get these things. So I definitely think there will be an operational challenge. It'll be interesting to see if brands like Oyo or some of the larger economy brands, Choice or other ones, are able to come up with a solution. I think historically these hotels have been more on the technology side, giving you partners, and it's a network that you can kind of work with to figure the best thing out for your market. But in terms of the day-to-day burden, it's going to definitely impact hotels that are smaller operations in a more severe way. So it'll be interesting from a owner and operator perspective if we see hotels, change flags or, go from an independent to a brand, or, the management style changes. If anything, I think we're in a period of rapid innovation. And so we're going to have these challenges that we haven't had to shoulder. I think we'll figure it out, but it's definitely going to affect different hotel types more or less severely.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And probably consolidation and ownership, all those changes with the market, with pricing and profitability are in the horizon, whether it's near or midterm. Next question is from Wendy. She's asking about length of stay. Actually, DMOs do care about length of stay. Are you seeing any changes in length of stay year over year versus number of people per room?
So we don't track number of people in room. So I can't give you a benchmark perspective on that. But in terms of length of stay, we are. And specifically, the longer length of stay business in the US has been more resilient. We actually published a special report that you can download for free on our website on how the extended stay community is doing during COVID-19 compared to non-extended stay properties. And the biggest takeaway was hotels with business that's, considerably 30 plus nights or more, they have been less affected during this time. There's also a kind of hypothesis that housing is a little uncertain right now. people's ability to stay in their homes. There may be some displacement that is a demand driver for, again, some of those extended stay type hotels. So it's interesting. We're seeing booking lead time shrink. People are making their reservations shorter, but in terms of the business that's maintained, it's actually been the longer length of stays that have done better than the shorter.
Yeah, I love seeing that data point from booking window perspective. It is shrinking. It's probably going to be in that perspective in the next at least 3 months. That's what I'm anticipating. But it has literally went down 3 times lower than what it used to be. It's drastic. We are literally making decisions day by day. Things are changing constantly. So, Vince, I love the fact that you talked about remote interactions, and you are in DC. I'm based in Richmond, Virginia. In normal times, probably we would have figured out how to be in the same conference room or so and have this session together, but that's not the case. And businesses are adopting new habits, events, conferences, everything has been repurposed. Lots of virtual, lots of hybrid. From a long-term perspective, what are some best practices that you are hearing from hoteliers, how they are going to reinvent, repurpose their spaces?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Again, if we kind of think about how the workplace is changing, while large in-person events may be on a longer recovery curve, work remote culture has changed. And I think what you're going to see is a lot of companies that no longer have maybe formal office space as much, and their employees that are work from home. Every once in a while, they want to work in person. And so I do think hotels in kind of the smaller group side of the world may have an ability to adapt to type of a, I don't want to say a like co-working space, like a WeWork, but I would say more of a, maybe we're going to do an offsite, as it may have historically been called, although now it's getting together instead of leaving your office. So I do think we're seeing a lot of hotel sales teams try and come up with packages and operations for maybe the one-day in-person meeting, where an office is getting together and working in the same space if they are a company where employees have gone fully work remote.
Lots of change. That's our life. When we look at that COVID recovery, April 10, you mentioned that April 10 was the worst it could be. It was one of the dips that you have seen, I think, especially from a corporate perspective. June, we have seen an uptick, especially starting from after Memorial Day, early June to mid-June, and now it's starting to level down a little bit. 4th of July was around literally last weekend, and the numbers are coming in. A lot of people are seeing uptick. Is that uptick going to stay, or how is the rest of the summer looking like?
It's hard to say exactly, what is going to happen, but from our perspective, we do anticipate local leisure travel to continue. Whether the right decision or not, I think a lot of Americans are going to continue to have a vacation mindset. Maybe while the kids are still out of school, with the thought that they're going back in the fall, families are going to still be taking trips while they can. So I think, for the end of July and beginning of August, we may continue to see a lot of that drive-in local leisure business maintain. But I do think that a lot of the metropolitan areas that had maybe a faster, came back faster than others, those trends will not continue. I do think there have been more cross-state regulations, things like New York City requiring a 14-day quarantine from certain states. That's really going to discourage some of the travel that we saw in May and June, but I don't think it's all going to go away. And I do think a lot of companies are coming back online in the travel industry. A lot of supply, people going to do site visits for openings and acquisitions. that type of business is still continuing. And so while again, if you're in a market that's very dependent on kind of broader domestic travel, that's probably unlikely. But I do think that, you know, we will see kind of more micro and local travel continue, whether that's the right thing or not. And so what might happen is there's been a lot of forecasting that Q4 was going to be where a lot of this stuff was put off to, you know, oh, we're supposed to meet in March, we're going to meet now in October. I think a lot of those Q4 plans are going to get pushed off to 2021. So, you know, again, at the beginning of this crisis, we kind of just put everything to the end of the year. And as we go through it, I do think that a fair amount of things will continue, but it's not going to be everything that was kind of rebooked for later in the year. And so, you know, again, from a group perspective, that cancellation and booking rates that we're updating on our website, that to me is going to be what makes or breaks the rest of the year. How many of those events can actually hang on for Q4 or not. But, you know, I think at least for the summer, we will see still leisure travel continue for the next couple weeks.
Awesome. Thank you, Vince. This was very insightful, whether we are looking at past or forward-looking data. We appreciate your time. And just a reminder to everyone, Marketing Outlook is still happening, and Vince is also going to be there in Bethesda.
Yeah, we'll be there for sure.
So we are looking forward to seeing everyone. And I know the numbers are a little bit anxious and all over the place, but let's remember that vacation mindset is here to stay. Thank you, and we wish everyone a wonderful day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.